is that so many people who are part of the elite, or part of the ruling classes, seem to think that capitalism, like, well, people like has all been around. That's something I haven't really seen before. I mean, I'm not that old. Maybe in the 60s they were convinced that I'm wrong. But you see this kind of panic reaction to social movements. You see this incredible emphasis on repression, on preemption, of trying to nip anything that looks like an alternative in the bud. This is like panicked behavior. This is not the behavior of self-confident ruling class. Especially because it's suppressing their own ability to come up with new ideas. I always give the example of precarious labor. Precarious labor is not a particularly effective way of organizing labor for productive purposes economically. It's an incredibly effective means of depoliticizing labor. One of the major effects of precarity is that it makes it very difficult for anybody to think in long-term perspective and therefore to like imagine their own political situation. That increasing working hours would look really stupid economically. Make it almost impossible to have a working class movement. Now, one of the weird side effects of this constant promotion of short-term perspectives of insecurity and precarity is that it comes to affect the politicians, and they can't think more than 3 years ahead either. And now they're heading into a crisis, they just don't know what to do. They've completely lost the ability to think big. I find myself having these guys wanting to talk to me. I mean, if they ever want to talk to me, they're in real trouble. It's kind of amazing. So this is one reason I think that we might well be at such a juncture that people running things seem to be in a veritable panic. And it's ironic because so many of the people in the opposition feel helpless, weak, pathetic, and ineffective. And it gradually occurs to me that one reason for that is that it seems to be the major priority to people running the world is that we feel that way. If they're spending all this time and resources making us feel incompetent and depressed, they must think we're incredibly important and have the potential to really do some damage to them. So this is, as I say, this is the reason why I think we are at some kind of cataclysmic moment. Now, what's going to come of it? All right, I'll give another example. I actually had a conversation at the Federal Reserve a few weeks ago with someone who, I won't name, but was saying according to their models, there's going to be almost complete economic collapse in the U.S. in a few years, much worse than 2008, unless they do massive debt forgiveness. They're trying to figure out how to get this through politically. These are people who are really concerned. The Euro crisis seems to be just the sort of first glimpse of a series of things. There have been debt crises, of course, since the 70s. We've had nothing but a series of debt crises since the 70s. But they managed to contain them in the Global South. I think the Global South really successfully resisted that. The IMF most dramatically was kicked out of first East Asia and then Latin America. Now it's kind of come back home. But all signs indicate these crises are going to keep mounting. And the only way the system's going to save itself is by doing something really bold and new. And I just think that the system has lost the ability to do that sort of thing.
Next and last question is about transition or a possible process of transition. Seeing as historically since the Bolshevik Revolution, horizontal elements, historically often anarchist elements, have repeatedly been sidelined by the better organized vertical organizations, historically communist or Marxist organizations. What can we do to avoid this from happening in the future? How can we spread horizontal, consensus-oriented, decentralized assembly structures through the population, given that most people find horizontal politics time-consuming or not effective on first sight?
Okay, I will respond to two elements of that, which I find problematic. One is that vertical guys are better organized. I don't think that's actually the case. I think that what vertical organizations are superior in one or two areas. The problem has been that for most of the 20th century, those one or two areas have been the ones that have been prioritized by the situation, by which I mean essentially they're much better at military stuff. They're much better at violence. If you look at the history of revolutionary politics the last 150 years, late in the 1880s and the 1890s, in the years leading up to World War I, it was anarchism actually, and the various traditions of horizontal organizing that actually were the heart of the revolutionary left. They were strikingly effective. However, since the Bolshevik Revolution story usually goes, this hasn't been the case. Why? Since World War I itself was the real breaking point. Because if you look at it, from the period 1914 to maybe 89, 91, what we've seen is a world where it has been pretty much continually either fighting or preparing for world wars. Well, yeah, I mean, in that context, Marxist organizations are going to seem more effective. It is true that a Marxist vertical organization will be much better at creating vast tank armies than anarchists ever will. I don't think that is really a bad reflection on anarchists. But, the moment you have a situation such as we've seen after 89-91, where it seems like war between a country like France, to take an example, or any country within Europe, a major developed country, seems just as impossible as it would have seemed in the 1890s. Suddenly anarchism reappears as a global social movement and Marxism seems to be marginalized again. So I don't think it's just the fate of the Soviet Union that's caused this change in perspective. In terms of people's experience of horizontality, okay. I think that perhaps people have different experiences. My experience in America has been that most people find the experience of horizontality a revelation when they first encounter it, just because they've been taught to think these things are impossible. It is very true that there's problems of endless meetings with sort of exasperating kinds of extremely difficult experiences that we all have after that, and a lot of people burn out fairly quickly, but part of this is we're just reinventing a democratic culture out of nothing where none of us have any experience in it. So obviously it's going to take a while for people to learn how to do this sort of thing. We have this paradox where we live in societies where we're all taught that democracy is our highest value, but none of us have any experience practicing democracy. And you can't just suddenly turn it on overnight if you've never done it before. I lived in Madagascar where people were lived under regimes that were ostensibly democratic, but were completely corrupt or they lived under colonial regimes for years which didn't even pretend to be democratic. But they practiced direct democracy all the time. So everybody knew how to do consensus from the time they were 5 years old. It went fine. That's just the way people do things. We lack that kind of democratic culture. It's something that has to be learned from the ground up, and I think there's nothing more important to do than to start that process rolling along. And once people have the basic sensibilities, believe me, I've seen this, it gets much easier.
Okay, thank you. I think we can open the discussion now, so if you have any questions or any experiences or positions to share, please come here to the microphone. The cable is not that long. We will collect the questions, 2 or 3 questions, and then they